Let me paint you a quick picture. You've got gear, excavators, machineries, cranes, vehicles, whatever it is, and right now that gear is sitting in someone else's yard. So maybe you're hiring it out to customers, or maybe you've got an asset holding company and your operating business is the one using it. But either way, it's your stuff, but it's not actually in your hands. So most people figure that because they own it, they're covered. Like if something goes sideways, if the company using your gear goes under, you're just going to rock up, grab it, and that would make sense, right? But that's not how it works. If you haven't registered your interest properly, you can lose your own equipment. It gets swept into the insolvent company's asset pool and sold off to pay their creditors. Your gear, it's gone. So I know that sounds a bit dramatic, but honestly it happens way more often than you think. So to maximise our time this evening, I've asked Simon to take the wheel and walk us through the whole thing from start to finish. He's built today's session around questions people often ask, like what the PPSA actually is, how it catches equipment hire and cross-hire setups, the registration traps that quietly catch people out, and what really happens when insolvency hit. And most importantly, some practical steps you can take to make sure your assets are protected. But one quick thing before we dive in, stick around till the end because I'll show you exactly what to do next to protect your own gear. So Simon, thanks for being here, mate. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Excellent. Thank you, Troy. And look, I appreciate the opportunity of being here to talk about what is one of my passions, and that's the PPSA. So for many of you, I will be the most boring person you hear or see this week and probably this month. But to be honest, as Troy said, you know, the PPSA is something that has come along that not everybody is aware of, and unfortunately, equipment owners are losing their assets to insolvent customers, which sounds absolutely ridiculous. But to give you an idea, in the last 24 hours, I've heard of asset owners losing almost $30 million worth of equipment out of two insolvencies, one of which involved a crane company and one of which involved Northern Territory. They're just losing these assets because either they're not complying with the PPSA or they're not complying correctly. So please, if you take anything away from this afternoon or this evening, please give some consideration and work out whether or not the PPSA will actually apply to your business. So throughout the evening, I'm going to be discussing all the sorts of attributes which would indicate that the PPSA might apply to your business. And at the end of it, we've got a little questionnaire that you can use to assess yourself whether the PPSA has application. And please, if it does, you need to comply with it. And as you'll see this evening, the compliance is not hard. And you wonder why everybody isn't doing it. The reason they're not doing it is they don't know. Now, a bit of CYA, which stands for cover my ass in this case. I'm not a lawyer. This is just some, I guess, information that we've generated after almost 16 years of working in this particular area. Tonight we're going to look at the fundamentals for equipment owners. So we're specifying equipment owners and the impact that the PPSA might have on you. We're going to look at how you can comply with the PPSA and see just how easy it is. We're going to spend a special attention on asset protection structures and the issues that they have with the PPSA, what impact insolvency has, and some practical steps that you can adopt to ensure that you're practicing best practice and complying with the PPSA. Just give you a little bit of rundown on who I am and what I'm doing here and why you should be listening to me. I've spent almost 30 years of my life as a former insolvency practitioner. So I was one of the bastards taking assets, and now, if you like, I've jumped the fence and the poacher's become the gamekeeper, and now I help my clients protect themselves from the insolvency of their customer and the possible loss of their equipment. We started this business back in 2010. That's my CEO, Lisa Keane, and we've advised literally thousands of businesses right around Australia on the PPSA. Okay, let's kick this off. What is the PPSA in a nutshell? Now, it is the Personal Property Securities Act. Personal property means everything that you own in a business is personal property. It's not your jet ski, it's not your boat, it's nothing like that. It is all of the assets of a business. So the Personal Property Securities Act was introduced back in 2009 and it now takes effect. But what does it actually mean? All it is a register of security interests. And don't worry if you don't understand what that means right now, you will do. The best example I can give is that many of you will remember the old REVs, which was a register of encumbered vehicles. And each state around Australia had its own register of encumbered vehicles. And if you were Toyota Finance and you've just financed a Hilux, you'd register your interest in that Hilux. Now, if I went down on the weekend and thought I'll buy that Hilux from somebody selling it on the corner, the first thing I'd do is go to Revs and check to see if there was a registration against it, and that would indicate that somebody had a security over that Hilux. All they've done since the creation of digital and digitisation of everything, they've created an online register. And if you think of Revs, this is just Revs on steroids. So anybody that has a security interest now needs to register it on this government register. Okay, so if you've got a security interest, you must register it. One of the issues for equipment owners is that the PPS Act itself says that you have a security interest. Ownership doesn't mean ownership like it used to. Ownership is more around a security interest. And if you've got a security interest, you have to register it. And the old expression, possession is 9/10 of the law. Now possession is almost 10/10 of the law. So you need to consider the PPSA whenever you pass possession of your equipment to somebody else in some way. And this is the whole key. So probably the best example I can give is, remember the days when you got a footy, netball, whatever it was, Christmas came along and you got your footy. First thing you did was write your name on it, because that meant that if you passed possession of your footy to somebody else, they knew it was yours. And you could always find your footy because it had your name on it. And that was the intention. Think of the PPS register as exactly that. Today we have a digital register, and if you pass possession of your equipment to somebody else, you need to think, I better register it on this government register so the whole world knows, even though it's in that person's possession, that business's possession, that property, that equipment still belongs to me. So that's what this is all about, making sure you register your interest in your gear whenever you pass possession of it to somebody else. Because if you don't register it, you lose your security interest on the insolvency of your customer, which means that you're going to lose not only your security interest, but your equipment, and it will pass to the benefit of your customer. Your equipment simply vests in the insolvent customer. I know that sounds completely crazy. It makes no sense that as an owner of equipment that you happen to have hired or rented or leased or provided it to a customer, their insolvency should trigger your loss of that gear. You will see some examples in a moment, but that is actually what this legislation is all about. So I think of registering, if I'm an equipment owner, I will register my interest in my gear because it ensures that I can recover that equipment on the insolvency of my customer. I don't register, I could potentially lose it to that insolvent customer. That's it in a nutshell. The question then is, well, when should you comply? You're an equipment owner, when should you comply with the PPSA? I would say when possession passes, but the law is a little more nuanced than that. In fact, the PPSA is one of the worst pieces of legislation for complexity and using a language that very few people understand. It's difficult. But essentially what the PPSA says is, if you have a lease, hire, rental arrangement that creates what's called a PPS lease, you absolutely have to comply with the PPSA, otherwise you're going to lose your equipment on your customer's insolvency. So when do we get a PPS lease? When does that arise? 99% of people will tell you that if the lease, the term of hire, or the rental is more than 2 years, the PPSA will apply. That's all they say, that's it. That is very true. So if you've got a long-term lease, it definitely is a PPS lease, you definitely must comply. But this is not the only occasion that you'll have something called a PPS lease. So if you've got a term of less than 2 years, but it rolls over, so maybe a monthly, you go to monthly, and it rolls past 2 years, it becomes a PPS lease. Or this is the one that catches most of our clients, and that is where you have a shorter term lease, but it's renewable at your customer's request. They can renew that term for more than 2 years. So they have the capacity of renewing the lease for a longer term where it might go past 2 years, that becomes a PPS lease from year one, or day one, if you like.
Wow.
So
Okay.
this is not just more than 2 years. People will tell you that's the only time the PPSA applies. That is not correct. Furthermore, there are a whole lot of these other situations where the PPSA will apply, okay? Because these are other secure, wet and dry hire. If you think that wet hire protects your property, that is not correct. You might pass possession and have one of your operators sitting on that piece of equipment and operating it, but they'll be operating it under the control of your customer. Where do they leave that equipment at the end of the day? What happens over Christmas? All of these sorts of things come into it. And the reason I say that this is such a grey area is if you can imagine, let's say you're in construction. You've got 4 or 5 pieces of gear that are worth a couple of $1 million. If an insolvency practitioner is appointed to that site, you can bet your bottom dollar they're going to be finding every loophole, every reason to argue that you should have registered, but you failed because they get to keep the gear. So wet and dry hire, there's no difference between the two as far as the PPSA is concerned. If your gear is hired by your customer, then that becomes a commercial consignment to which the PPSA will apply from day one.
Wow.
If you've got an internal hire arrangement, then you do need to comply with the PPSA because you'll have a long-term lease. If you're asked to sign your customer's agreement, so instead of them signing your terms and conditions for the hire, they say, look, we're big enough, we're not going to sign your terms, you have to sign our supply arrangement. What is that supply agreement arrangement saying about their rights? Unless you read every single one of those clauses in those sorts of agreements, you're never going to be certain. I've seen many which will create a PPS lease from day one because it gives the customer the unilateral right to renew for as long as they like, which meets that third term of less than 2 years but capable of being renewed for more than 2, where it might go past 2. So there is an issue there. If you have anything like a rent to buy or option to purchase in your agreement, the PPSA is going to comply. And then finally, as I said before, the insolvency practitioners are looking for any way that they can keep your gear. There's an argument that was accepted by the courts that it could occur, is the right of reversion. So that's your right as an owner of the equipment to go and recover that equipment from your customer if they stop paying you. Well, hang on, isn't that everybody's right as an owner? If the customer's not paying you for the use of your gear, yeah, you can go and take it back. Insolvency practitioners are trying to argue that that's a security interest that should be registered, and a failure to register it means you lose your security and you lose the gear. So really what I'm saying is, I would take a rule of thumb, and that is if your term of hire is less than 6 months, perhaps don't worry about the PPSA, as long as you don't have a rent to buy in there and an internal hire, all these other situations. But if it is longer than that, you need to consider compliance with the PPSA. But what does that mean? How hard is it to comply with the PPSA? This is how hard it is, okay? Whether you're a sales company, you're selling goods on credit, whether you're a hire company, you're hiring out gear, it doesn't matter what you do, you're going to have a whole bunch of customers out there. Most people think that you need to register each item of equipment. That is not correct. It is not the registration of every piece of equipment, it's the registration of every customer. So if you have no vehicles included in your fleet, or you're not selling motor vehicles, then all you have to do is what are called other goods registrations. You do 2 of them against each customer. You're compliant. Any equipment that is in your customer's hands when they fall over into insolvency is returned to you. That's how hard it is. Right? Now, if you happen to have some vehicles in your fleet that you might be providing to customers, then you do 2 general motor vehicles. So now we've got a total of 4 registrations against your customers. Those 4 registrations protect every transaction you have with that customer for the next 7 years, and it costs $6 in government charges per registration. That is not a significant investment when you consider how long it's protecting you. So in the event that one of your customers becomes insolvent, these registrations will protect your equipment and ensure that it is returned to you. It might not protect the money that you're owed for the use of that equipment, but at least you get your gear back. Because I'll show you in a moment how tragic it can be on an insolvency and what can happen in the real world. Why would you try and avoid the PPSA? If there is ever a chance that the PPSA applies, then my view is you would comply with it because it's not expensive to do so. Yet it is a bit complicated to get your registrations right, and most people don't. But it's not impossible, and it's certainly not a costly experience. So, you know, there's a big risk if you don't, and you can cover that risk quite easily. When it comes to registrations, in this example here, we would deal with most of our clients on day one. We do all of their customers, bang. And then as soon as a new customer comes along, you do a registration against that customer before you supply them with any equipment or sell them anything. So they sign your credit application, they sign your terms and conditions of trade, they agree to all of that, you register them on day one. You don't have to think about them again, whether they rent for a short period or long period, it doesn't matter. You don't have to manage that relationship because that customer's registered. Now, at the end of 7 years, if they're still a customer, you renew the registration and pay another $6. Or you just let it pass, let it go past, and it'll end in 7 years. It's over. The registration's gone. So this is not very difficult, but gee, it can be really important. But I said before, it's not a DIY project. So for those of you that are looking at this saying, that's cool, we're complying with the PPSA, we do something called an assurance review, PPS assurance review. And we've done well over 1,000 of these, and the stats are really bad. So about 97, in fact, it's more than 97% of the reviews that we've done indicate either a failure in policy and or the registrations. And the numbers here get worse. We see an error rate of between 15 and 100%. I get on my hobby horse here because I'm seeing people trying to comply with this legislation. The legislation is complicated. It requires a lot of things from you. But if you're having a crack, you might as well make sure you're doing it correctly. Get the right advice. Speak to your lawyer. Speak to us. Speak to any other advisors you can find. The reality here is that it's just too difficult to do yourselves, and it's just not worth the risk. Some of the things that you'll have to understand when you're performing a registration is who your customer is. They're called a grantor. They're granting you the right to take security in your own gear. I know that sounds crazy, but that's what they're called. So your customer's called a grantor. You have to register them in a certain way. So if they're a proprietary limited company, you must use their ACN, not their ABN. Unless it's a trust, then you can use the ABN's trust, but you shouldn't register the trustee. But if you do register the trustee, you've got to use its ACN. But then if it's a partnership, you can use its ABN. But if it's a sole trader who has an ABN, you can't use that. You've got to use the sole trader's full name and date of birth. You make a mistake on this, and your registration is invalidated. So probably the worst example of that was a company called One Steel in South Australia. When it collapsed, a company called All Leasing that was leasing some equipment to One Steel, they'd registered One Steel using One Steel's ABN. It was completely correct. It was the right ABN, but the Act says you must use the ACN. They lost $23 million worth of equipment because they registered by ABN and not ACN. This is a very tough piece of legislation. If you get it wrong, your registration is going to be invalid. So we've got to know the grantor, we've got to know the customer well. Timing is even worse. So if you hire to somebody that is going to use your equipment in their business, so they won't treat it like inventory, but they'll use it within their business, then you have 15 business days to register on the passing of possession. Now remember before I said register right at the very beginning of the relationship. Most people don't. They wait till the transaction and then register after the transaction. So if the transaction happens, possession of your gear passes to your customer, you have 15 business days as long as they're not going to on-hire or cross-hire it. If they're going to on-hire it or cross-hire it, they're going to treat it as inventory, you must register before they get possession. This is all too complicated. It makes it too hard. It's almost as if insolvency practitioners wrote this legislation for their benefit, making it very difficult for owners of equipment to correctly register their interest, even if they knew about the PPSA. So you've got these issues going on. You've also, when you perform a registration, you've got to make some elections. And if you get these elections wrong, at the very best, they'll undermine the value of your registration. At worst, they'll invalidate it. So you've got 9 classes to choose from and 21 subclasses of registrations of all different types of equipment. That can be complicated. Then they ask you, in the registration, it'll ask you if you're claiming proceeds, if your security interest is subordinated, if your collateral, the goods you're supplying, are going to be used as inventory by your customer, whether your security interest is a purchase money security interest, and whether you control the collateral. Now, get one of those questions wrong, particularly the PPSA question, and that completely undermines the quality of your registration. Then you'd think, well, if I make a mistake, I can correct it. There is an ability to amend registrations for minor issues, but not major. So perhaps the worst one we see is failing to elect this purchase money security interest, PPSA. Often registrations don't include the tick for a PPSA. That is really, really bad, and you need to elect PPSA, but you can't go back and change your registration if you make a mistake. You can only do a new one, and if you do a new one, your timing's going to be wrong. So please, get the right advice. If the PPSA does apply, and you are going to comply, please get the right advice on how to do it. It's worth every cent you're going to pay for it. Okay, asset protection structures. Now, if I put my insolvency cap back on, I love these structures. Okay, fairly straightforward. Asset owning entity provides the equipment to a trading entity. They're related parties, often with the same shareholders in the same group. And the intention here is very straightforward. The asset company is the owner of the equipment. It supplies that equipment to the trading company, and trading company is out there in the big bad world incurring all the liabilities of a trading company. And if the worst happens and the trading company gets into a bit of bother, at least if it collapses into insolvency, Asset Co can take the assets out of the trading company and take it back into their control. So the shareholders overall might have a problem in trading company, but at least they've got their assets out of the trading company, and those assets aren't being used to meet the claims of unsecured creditors in the trading company. That's how these structures are supposed to work. They still work that way as long as they comply with the PPSA. And my great concern here is that most accountants that I have experienced are not explaining this to their customer. So they're setting these structures up without proper protection. Let's see what happens, because we know that that's going to be a long-term lease between Asset Co and Trading Co. That satisfies the very basic PPS lease, so there must be compliance. Let's assume in this example there's 900 grand's worth of equipment from Asset Co to Trading Co. That equipment has been financed, if you like, by a number of different equipment financiers, and let's assume there's 435 grand still owing in equipment finance on that gear. Problem here, this is a pretty typical structure, nothing complicated about this. What happens if the trading company collapses into insolvency? As long as the asset company has registered its interest, so is complying with the PPSA against Trading Co., as long as it's done those 4 registrations, it will get the equipment back. But if it's not complying or hasn't properly registered its interest against Trading Co., it will lose all of that gear, and that's called vesting. So the assets of Asset Co. will simply vest in the trading company and be available for the benefit of all the creditors of the trading company, which defeats completely the purpose of this structure, completely. It was set up to protect assets. Because it's not complying with the PPSA, it hasn't achieved the basic purpose for its establishment. So those assets will simply vest. What's worse than that, the vesting actually technically occurs a nanosecond before the insolvency practitioner is appointed. So it's not like the appointment and then vesting occurs. Vesting occurs before the administrator, liquidator, receiver walks in. That means that they don't need to argue with you about who owns it. You have to prove that you've registered correctly, because the law will say they've walked into a business, those assets were the assets of the business because of these vesting rules. So very dangerous piece of legislation. And then, you're thinking, well, this it doesn't make sense. There's got to be some priority here. Somebody has to have a better claim. In that argument between Asset Co and Trading Co, Asset Co will win and get its gear back as long as it complies. If it's not complying, it never will. But what about the financiers here? Because, hang on, the financiers have a claim against Asset Co. They definitely will have registered their interest in the equipment that they financed to Asset Co. So in the hands of the administrator now in Trading Co, the finance company's got registrations against that equipment. Doesn't that mean that the finance companies can come back in and take their gear back? No, they can't, because the finance company's relationship is with Asset Co. It's not with Trading Co. The security they have is against Asset Co. So if Asset Co can't get the equipment back into its possession, all of a sudden we have a situation where Asset Co has not only lost the equipment to the trading company and its unsecured creditors, but it still owes 435 grand to the financiers who can't go and get their equipment back. So it's a double whammy. You lose your gear and you still have to pay out the loan on it. But please, if you've got an asset protection structure and you're not complying with the PPSA, you really, really need to get your skates on and ensure that you are compliant, because it's just undermining the whole purpose of it all. Okay, this example here is how you would go about protecting yourselves. So let's see how difficult this is, because it's not difficult. Asset company to trading company, first thing, you need to have a written lease agreement. How many occasions I have seen these structures that don't have a document. If you don't have a document, an insolvency practitioner appointed to the trading co can interpret the relationship any way they like to their advantage. You need a lease agreement. The lease agreement needs to be PPSA compliant. You need to get one. And the registrations that you perform are, again, those two other goods and the two general motor vehicle registrations. They're your standard registrations. Put those in place between Asset Co and Trading Co. And we recommend that each vehicle is registered once between the two entities by reference to its VIN. And harken back to the old Revs days, what you want is each item of your equipment, if it is ever somebody tries to sell it illegally, the purchaser can do a search and see that you're the owner. But you only need to do that once in the life of that vehicle. You don't need to do it every time it goes from customer to customer, because the registrations you do then, so Asset Co to Trading Co, put these registrations in place. Trading Co to your customer, again, two other goods registrations against each, two general motor vehicles against each, and you're protected against their insolvency. That's it. That's compliance with the PPSA. That ensures that the trading company gets the gear back from insolvent customers. It ensures that the asset protection structure will work so that Asset Co can get the equipment back in the case of Trading Co collapses.
It's that simple.
It is that simple. I get frustrated by this. I mean, to tell you today that, close to $30 million worth of assets have disappeared in some insolvencies that we're involved with is
Today.
ridiculous. This is in the last 24 hours. We've seen seven cranes, a franner, all of this stuff just disappearing. Millions of dollars just going to insolvency practitioners because people don't comply with this legislation. So, okay, what do you do next, right? What do you want? I think the first question you have to ask yourself is, does the PPSA apply to your business? We put together a self-assessment checklist because you can do it, you can do it at home if you like. It takes about 3 minutes for equipment owners to go through a series of questions that if you answer yes to those questions, and the more you answer yes to, the greater the likelihood is that the PPSA is going to apply to your business. If you are selling goods on credit, you really must comply with the PPSA, because whilst the PPSA has been awful for equipment owners, it has been simply fantastic for suppliers of goods on credit terms. It has changed you from being an unsecured creditor to a secured creditor in your customer's insolvency. Very few people are aware of that. So again, on the sales side, there's a question there for you. Get advice. So if the answer is yes, you think the PPSA is going to apply, get some advice. Lawyers are okay at providing advice. perhaps not as practical as it should be. And if your lawyer provides advice on the PPSA, get them to give you some advice on compliance. We are the largest in Australia that's providing this advice. Limited providers of advice out there. It should be fairly straightforward. It really should be. So if you come to the conclusion that the PPSA applies, we'll give you a damn good rate on a report that will review your business, review your terms and conditions to trade, and will tell you whether the PPSA is going to impact your business and what you need to do about it and how you need to address that. We'll charge $220. Yes, it is an introductory service. We'll also offer you some of our other services which you can decide to take or not. You can do it yourself. The PPS impact assessment will really help you understand how the PPSA applies to your business. And if you are already complying, as I've said before, one of our $220 assurance reviews will tell you whether you really are, because most aren't. Then implement the PPSA. As I've shown you before, it's not expensive, and if you get the right advice on how to do the registrations, it should be fairly straightforward. And the only thing you really need to think about is every time you buy a new piece of equipment, every time you have a new customer, you just need to do another registration. And there's plenty of support around to help you with that. So, having support during this process is worthwhile. There's a lot at stake. If you've avoided insolvencies for a long period of time, it's not something I think you can avoid forever. It's my personal view that I think insolvencies are going to go up in the short term. We know that there's a lot of tax debt out there. And construction is going through some problems. So I think that, we're in an environment where there is going to be more insolvencies than less. And then maintain compliance. So registration is one thing. There is a requirement. You do need to keep up to date with what's going on. So you've got a 7-year registration period, but the government doesn't tell you when that registration period is up or when it's approaching. So you're going to have to maintain some details of your registrations, monitor them, renew them when you're required to. It's also a good idea to keep an eye out on your customer just to see if their ABN changes or is cancelled or anything happens like that. Always do a reconciliation to make sure all your customers are registered. If you're really boring like me, you keep up to date with the court cases, because that shows how the PPSA is changing and how it's being interpreted by the courts. Unfortunately, though, there were 340, and I say were because they're still out there, 345 amendments proposed to this piece of legislation, but it is so vast and it changes so much that I think it's been shelved for the foreseeable future. But at some point it's going to come in, because government is government, they like change. We're hopeful that they reduce the 345 proposed amendments down significantly. One question that Troy asked me that no one else has asked me ever before: what is the single biggest mistake that businesses make when it comes to the PPSA? And I think it is this. I have spoken to many lawyers and many businesses that immediately say the PPSA doesn't apply. And I go, really? Are you sure about that? Yes, we're sure. Yes, we're sure. Why are you so sure? Oh, because in this, and then they go through a very complicated explanation of why the PPSA won't apply to this particular business. To me, that is foolhardy. If you have any suspicion that the PPSA is going to apply today or in the future, then it's easier to comply than avoid it. And I say this with experience of many of the court cases that we see included legal advice that the PPSA would never apply to that business. So they didn't bother complying. And then all of a sudden, an insolvency practitioner says, yes, bang, it does comply, you've lost something. One of my angriest members, clients that we look after still, lost a trailer, I'm guessing about 8 years ago. Lost a trailer to an insolvent customer. Had never heard of the PPSA. Went completely mad. Being a Western Australian, he went out on site, grabbed his trailer and dragged it home. The administrators then tried to have him arrested for theft because it wasn't his trailer anymore.
Oh wow.
Yeah. Then he lost the trailer, couldn't remember where it was.
Yeah.
Ultimately, he won out because the administrators just gave up trying to find this. It was a big trailer. It was worth a lot of money. Ultimately, they just gave up. And, you know, I said, all the effort you've gone to, the possible, breaking of the law, all of these things, if you just complied, it would have been a lot easier. Oh, we didn't think it was going to apply. You know, we were told it doesn't apply. Get the right advice. The single biggest mistake I see.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it for me.
Look, thanks so much for that, Simon. That whole thing just blows my mind, and it's pretty clear the PPSA isn't something any business really should be ignoring. So I'm just going to recap a couple of quick things. So if you own gear that's sitting in someone else's hands, whether that's a customer or a related operating company. So I've got a lot of guys that are cross-hiring to their own entities. You need to understand whether you've got an interest that needs to be registered and then actually do something about it. The number of guys I've spoken to have just said, oh yeah, I know I need to do something, but they haven't done it. The cost of the registration is tiny compared to the cost of losing assets and insolvency. So this is what I would do. Audit your arrangements, go through every hire, lease, rental and cross-hire agreement you've got and work out which ones could be caught by the PPSA. The second thing is check your PPSA registrations. Jump on the website, make sure your existing registrations are current, recorded against the right entity, that your ACN, not your ABN, and that none of them have lapsed. And number three is, look, I'm a big believer in sticking in my lane. So book a chat with the PPS advisory. So get it on to Simon and his team. If you're not sure where you stand, don't guess. Let those guys do the health check for a couple $100. Seriously, could save you thousands of dollars. So feel free to reach out to them at ppsadvisory.com.au. And the last thing is we'll send out this recording as well. Pass it on to your accountant, your lawyer, your business partners. But don't wait for an insolvency event to find out you're not covered. That's the whole reason we did this today. So Simon, thanks again, mate. I really appreciate you making the time. And we'll catch you at the next one. Thank you.